The stars shimmered coldly in the vast emptiness of space, their light reflecting off the sleek hulls of the Galactic Coalition's warships. The fleet was gathered near the edge of the Orion sector, a tense silence hanging over the command deck. Admiral Krell, a towering figure with scales that glinted under the artificial light, stared at the holographic display. His sharp eyes scanned the data, his mind racing. The Coalition had been on edge for weeks, ever since strange energy signatures were detected in this sector. "Admiral," a voice crackled over the comms. It was Lieutenant Vora, the chief communications officer. "We're picking up another anomaly. It's massive." Krell's jaw tightened. "Show me." The holographic display flickered, and a new image appeared. At first, it was just a faint blip, barely noticeable. But within seconds, it grew larger, brighter, until it dominated the screen. The entire command deck fell silent as the object came into view. It was a ship. But not just any ship. The vessel was colossal, its design unlike anything the Coalition had ever seen. Its hull was a mix of sleek silver and weathered bronze, marked with symbols that glowed faintly in the darkness. The ship's sheer size dwarfed even the Coalition's largest dreadnoughts. "What in the name of the stars is that?" Krell muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. The crew scrambled to analyze the data. Sensors pinged furiously, trying to make sense of the ship's energy signatures. Then, one of the officers gasped. "Admiral, it's human." Krell's head snapped around. "What?" "The ship, it's human. The design, the markings, it matches records from the ancient archives. This is the Elysium. Humanity's legendary supercarrier." The name sent a chill through the room. The Elysium. A ship of myth and legend, lost centuries ago during the Great Collapse, when humanity's empire fell and the galaxy was reshaped. It was said to be the pinnacle of human engineering, a vessel capable of unimaginable feats. But no one had seen it in over 500 years. "Impossible," Krell growled. "Humanity is gone. Their empire is dust. This has to be some kind of trick." Before anyone could respond, the ship's systems lit up. A low hum filled the air, growing louder and louder until it was almost deafening. Then, with a blinding flash of light, the Elysium activated its thrusters and began to move. The Coalition fleet scrambled to react. Weapons were armed, shields raised, but the supercarrier made no hostile moves. Instead, it glided gracefully through the void, its massive engines glowing like miniature suns. "Admiral," Vora said, her voice trembling. "We're receiving a transmission from the ship." Krell hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Put it through." The holographic display shifted, and a figure appeared. It was a human, dressed in a uniform that looked both ancient and futuristic. His face was lined with age, but his eyes burned with a fierce intensity. "This is Captain Elias Grant of the Earth Supercarrier Elysium," the man said, his voice calm but commanding. "We have returned. And we bring a warning." The room erupted into chaos. Officers shouted, alarms blared, and Krell struggled to maintain order. But through it all, one thought echoed in his mind: humanity was back. And nothing would ever be the same. The command deck of the Coalition flagship was in turmoil. Officers shouted over each other, their voices a cacophony of fear and confusion. Admiral Krell stood at the center of it all, his scaled hands gripping the edge of the holographic display table. His sharp eyes were fixed on the image of Captain Elias Grant, the human who had just delivered a message that sent shockwaves through the entire fleet. "Silence!" Krell roared, his voice cutting through the chaos. The room fell quiet, though the tension remained thick enough to cut with a blade. "Play the transmission again," Krell ordered, his tone icy. The holographic display flickered, and Captain Grant's image reappeared. His words echoed through the room, each syllable heavy with meaning. This is Captain Elias Grant of the Earth Supercarrier Elysium. We have returned. And we bring a warning. The transmission ended abruptly, leaving the room in stunned silence. Krell's mind raced as he processed the implications. Humanity's return was impossible, or so he had been taught. The Great Collapse had wiped them out centuries ago, their empire reduced to ruins and their people scattered to the winds. Yet here was the Elysium, a relic of their golden age, floating in the void like a ghost from the past. "Admiral," Lieutenant Vora said cautiously, breaking the silence. "What do we do?" Krell didn't answer immediately. His thoughts turned to the history lessons he had been forced to endure as a young cadet. The rise and fall of humanity was a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked ambition. The Galactic Coalition had been founded in the aftermath of their collapse, a union of species determined to prevent such a catastrophe from ever happening again. And now, humanity had returned. "Contact the High Council," Krell said finally. "They need to know about this immediately." As Vora relayed the orders, Krell turned his attention back to the holographic display. The Elysium loomed in the distance, its massive silhouette a stark reminder of humanity's once unrivaled power. The ship's design was both ancient and advanced, a paradox that defied explanation. Its hull was covered in intricate carvings and glowing symbols, some of which matched the records in the Coalition's archives. "Admiral," another officer called out. "We're detecting unusual energy readings from the human ship. It's unlike anything we've ever seen." Krell's jaw tightened. "What kind of energy?" "It's hard to say, sir. The readings are off the charts. If our sensors are correct, that ship could have enough power to destroy an entire star system." The room fell silent once more as the weight of those words sank in. Krell's mind raced with possibilities. Was this a threat? A warning? Or something else entirely? Before he could decide, the comms system crackled to life again. "Admiral Krell," Captain Grant's voice echoed through the room. "We request permission to dock with your flagship. There is much to discuss, and time is of the essence." Krell hesitated. Allowing a human ship, especially one as powerful as the Elysium, to dock with his flagship was a risk. But what choice did he have? Ignoring the humans could be just as dangerous. "Grant them permission," Krell said finally. "But keep our weapons armed and our shields up. If they try anything," he didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. As the crew scrambled to prepare for the docking procedure, Krell's thoughts turned to the High Council. He could already imagine their reaction to this news. The Coalition had spent centuries erasing humanity's legacy, burying their achievements and rewriting history to paint them as villains. Now, their greatest fear had come true. Humanity was back. And they were not alone. The docking bay of the Coalition flagship was a hive of activity. Armed guards lined the walls, their weapons trained on the massive airlock as it hissed open. Admiral Krell stood at the forefront, his posture rigid and his expression unreadable. Behind him, a team of scientists and engineers waited nervously, their instruments ready to scan and analyze anything that came through the door. The airlock opened fully, revealing a group of humans. They were dressed in uniforms that seemed both ancient and futuristic, their designs a blend of practicality and elegance. At their head was Captain Elias Grant, his piercing eyes scanning the room with a calm intensity. "Admiral Krell," Grant said, his voice steady. "Thank you for allowing us to board." Krell nodded curtly. "Let's make this quick, Captain. You've already caused enough disruption." Grant's lips twitched in what might have been a smile. "I understand your skepticism. But what we have to share is too important to ignore." The humans were escorted to a secure conference room, where Krell and his top advisors gathered around a large table. The atmosphere was tense, the air thick with unspoken questions and fears. "Before we begin," Krell said, his voice sharp, I want to know how you survived. Humanity was wiped out centuries ago. Your empire is gone. Your people are scattered. So how is it that you've returned now, of all times? Grant leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. The truth is, Admiral, we never truly disappeared. When the Great Collapse began, the Elysium was sent on a mission to protect humanity's legacy. We traveled to the edge of known space, far beyond the reach of the Coalition's sensors. There, we waited. Waited for what? One of the advisors asked. For the right time to return, Grant replied. And for the threat we knew was coming. Krell's eyes narrowed. What threat? Grant hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. We call it the Void Swarm. A species of beings that consume everything in their path, planets, stars, entire civilizations. They are the reason the Elysium was built. Humanity foresaw their arrival and created this ship to stand against them. The room fell silent as the weight of Grant's words sank in. Krell exchanged a glance with his advisors, their expressions a mix of disbelief and unease. And why should we believe you? Krell asked finally. For all we know, this is some elaborate trick to regain your lost power. Grant's expression hardened. We have no interest in power, Admiral. Our only goal is survival, for humanity, and for the galaxy. If you don't believe us, come aboard the Elysium. See for yourself. Krell hesitated. The offer was tempting, but it was also a risk. Still, he couldn't deny the curiosity gnawing at him. What secrets did the Elysium hold? And what proof did the humans have of this so-called Void Swarm? Very well, Krell said finally. But if this is a trap, it's not, Grant interrupted. You have my word. An hour later, Krell and a small team of scientists and guards stepped aboard the Elysium. The interior of the ship was unlike anything they had ever seen. The walls were lined with glowing panels, and the air hummed with energy. Everywhere they looked, there were signs of advanced technology that surpassed anything the Coalition possessed. Grant led them to the ship's central command center, where a massive holographic display dominated the room. The display showed a map of the galaxy, with a cluster of red dots moving steadily toward the center. This is the Void Swarm, Grant said, gesturing to the red dots. They've already consumed dozens of star systems on the edge of the galaxy. And they're heading this way. Krell stared at the display, his mind racing. The evidence was compelling, but he still had doubts. If this is true, he said slowly, why haven't we detected them before now? Because they move in the shadows, Grant replied. They avoid detection until it's too late. But the Elysium sensors are far more advanced than anything you have. We've been tracking them for years. One of the scientists stepped forward, her eyes wide with awe. This technology, it's incredible. How did humanity achieve this? Grant's expression softened. We had help. From a species that no longer exists. They shared their knowledge with us, and we used it to build the Elysium. But even this ship may not be enough to stop the Void Swarm. That's why we've returned, to warn you, and to ask for your help. Krell's mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. The evidence was hard to ignore, but trusting the humans was another matter entirely. What do you propose? He asked finally. Grant met his gaze, his eyes filled with determination. An alliance. Humanity and the Coalition, working together to stop the Void Swarm. It's the only way we'll survive. Krell didn't answer immediately. The stakes were high, and the risks were even higher. But as he looked around the command center, at the advanced technology and the determined faces of the humans, he realized one thing: they had no choice. The Coalition's High Council chamber was a grand, circular room with towering walls adorned with the symbols of its member species. Representatives from across the galaxy sat in their designated seats, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. At the center of the room stood Admiral Krell, his scaled hands clasped behind his back as he addressed the assembly. "Esteemed members of the council," Krell began, his voice echoing through the chamber. "I bring news of a grave threat, one that could endanger us all." He gestured to the holographic display behind him, which showed the map of the galaxy with the red dots representing the Void Swarm. The room erupted into murmurs as the representatives took in the information. "This," Krell continued, "is the Void Swarm. A species of beings that consume everything in their path. They have already destroyed dozens of star systems, and they are heading toward the heart of the galaxy." One of the representatives, a tall, insect-like creature from the Zorith Collective, raised a clawed hand. "And how do we know this information is accurate? For all we know, this could be a ploy by the humans to regain their former power." Krell's jaw tightened. "I understand your skepticism. But I have seen the evidence with my own eyes. The human supercarrier, the Elysium, possesses technology far beyond our own. Their sensors have tracked the swarm's movements for years. And their warning is clear: if we do not act, we will all be consumed." Another representative, a humanoid with shimmering blue skin from the Aquarian Federation, spoke up. "And what do the humans propose we do?" Krell hesitated for a moment before answering. "They propose an alliance. A united front against the swarm. They believe that only by working together can we hope to survive." The room erupted into chaos. Representatives shouted over each other, their voices a cacophony of fear, anger, and disbelief. Krell waited for the noise to die down before raising his hand for silence. "I know this is difficult to accept," he said. "The humans were our enemies once. But they are not the same as they were centuries ago. They have returned not to conquer, but to protect. And if we are to survive, we must put aside our differences and stand together." The chamber fell silent as the representatives considered his words. Finally, the Zorith representative spoke again. "And what if this is a trick? What if the humans are using this so-called swarm to manipulate us?" Krell's eyes narrowed. "Then we will be no worse off than we are now. But if the swarm is real, and I believe it is, then we cannot afford to ignore this warning." After hours of debate, the council reached a decision. Reluctantly, they agreed to form an alliance with humanity. But the tension in the room was palpable, and Krell knew that trust would not come easily. Meanwhile, aboard the Elysium, Captain Elias Grant stood in the ship's observation deck, staring out at the stars. His mind was heavy with the weight of the task ahead. The Void Swarm was closer than ever, and time was running out. "Captain," a voice called from behind him. It was Dr. Lyra, the ship's chief scientist. "We've finished analyzing the swarm's movements. They'll reach the Orion sector in less than a month." Grant nodded grimly. "And the coalition?" "They've agreed to the alliance," Lyra replied. "But it's clear they don't trust us." "I don't blame them," Grant said with a sigh. "We've been gone for centuries. To them, we're ghosts from a forgotten age." Lyra stepped closer, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think they'll listen to us? When the time comes, will they fight alongside us?" Grant turned to face her, his eyes filled with determination. "They'll have to. Because if they don't, there won't be a galaxy left to fight for." As the days passed, the Coalition and humanity began preparations for the coming battle. The Elysium's technology was shared, though not without resistance from some Coalition members. The humans worked tirelessly to integrate their systems with the Coalition's fleet, but the process was slow and fraught with tension. One evening, as Grant reviewed the latest reports, he received a message from Admiral Krell. "Captain Grant," Krell's voice came through the comms. "We've detected a new development. The swarm has changed course. They're heading directly for the Orion sector." Grant's heart sank. The Orion sector was home to dozens of inhabited planets, including several key Coalition worlds. If the swarm reached it, the consequences would be catastrophic. Understood, Grant replied. We'll need to accelerate our preparations. The battle will begin sooner than we thought. Krell's voice was grim. Agreed. But there's something else. Some of my advisors are questioning the alliance. They believe we should focus on defending our own worlds, rather than risking everything on a joint effort. Grant's jaw tightened. If we don't stand together, we'll fall apart. The swarm doesn't care about borders or alliances. They'll destroy us all unless we stop them. There was a long pause before Krell responded. I know. But convincing the others won't be easy. Then we'll have to try harder, Grant said. Because if we fail, there won't be a second chance. The Orion sector buzzed with activity as the Coalition fleet gathered near the Elysium. Ships of all shapes and sizes filled the void, their lights flickering like stars against the darkness. It was an unprecedented sight, a united front of species that had once been divided by fear and mistrust. Admiral Krell stood on the bridge of his flagship, watching the fleet assemble. His scaled hands gripped the railing as he reviewed the latest reports. The void swarm was closer than ever, and the pressure was mounting. Admiral, Lieutenant Vora called out. The human delegation has arrived. Krell turned to see Captain Elias Grant and a small group of humans stepping onto the bridge. They carried themselves with a quiet confidence, their presence a reminder of the fragile alliance that had been forged. Captain Grant, Krell said, nodding in acknowledgement. I trust your preparations are complete? As complete as they can be, Grant replied. But there's still much to do. The swarm will be here in less than 2 weeks. Krell's jaw tightened. Then we'd better make every moment count. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Engineers and scientists from both the Coalition and humanity worked side by side, integrating the Elysium's advanced technology with the Coalition's fleet. It was a daunting task, and tensions ran high as the two sides struggled to overcome their differences. In one of the Coalition's engineering bays, a human technician named Yarok was working with a Zoreth engineer named Vex. The two had been assigned to upgrade the power systems of a Coalition cruiser, but their progress had been slow. This design is outdated, Yarok muttered as he examined the ship's schematics. We'll never get the power output we need with these systems. Vex's antennae twitched in irritation. These systems have served us well for centuries. Perhaps the problem is your inability to adapt. Yarok shot him a glare. The problem is your stubbornness. If we don't make these changes, your ship won't stand a chance against the swarm. The two continued to argue, their voices growing louder until a third figure stepped in. It was Dr. Lyra, the Elysium's chief scientist. Enough, she said firmly. We don't have time for this. The swarm doesn't care about our differences. If we're going to survive, we need to work together. Yarok and Vex exchanged a glance, their anger fading as they realized the truth in her words. You're right, Yarok said finally. Let's start over. Vex nodded. Agreed. Meanwhile, in the Coalition's command center, Admiral Krell and Captain Grant were meeting with the High Council. The mood was tense as the representatives debated their strategy. We should focus on defending our core worlds, the Zoreth representative argued. If we spread our forces too thin, we'll be vulnerable. And if we don't stop the swarm at the edge of the sector, they'll overrun us, Grant countered. We need to meet them head-on, with everything we've got. Krell listened in silence, his mind racing. The stakes were higher than ever, and the pressure was immense. Finally, he raised his hand for silence. Enough, he said. We've spent too much time arguing. The swarm is coming, and we need to act. Captain Grant is right, we must meet them head-on. But we'll also allocate resources to defend our core worlds. It's the only way. The room fell silent as the representatives considered his words. Finally, the Aquarian representative spoke up. Admiral Krell is right. We must stand together, or we will fall apart. One by one, the other representatives nodded in agreement. The alliance was fragile, but it was holding, for now. As the meeting adjourned, Grant approached Krell. "Thank you," he said quietly. "I know this isn't easy for you." Krell's expression was grim. "It's not. But you were right about one thing, we don't have a choice." Grant nodded. "We'll get through this. Together." Krell didn't respond, but the look in his eyes spoke volumes. The alliance was far from perfect, but it was a start. The final preparations were made as the fleet moved into position. The Elysium took its place at the forefront, its massive hull gleaming in the starlight. Behind it, the Coalition's ships formed a formidable line, their weapons armed and their shields raised. On the bridge of the Elysium, Grant stood with his crew, his eyes fixed on the holographic display. The swarm was close, too close. "This is it," he said, his voice steady. "We make our stand here." The crew nodded, their faces filled with determination. They knew the odds were against them, but they also knew what was at stake. As the swarm's fleet appeared on the horizon, a sense of calm settled over the bridge. The battle was about to begin, and there was no turning back. The void of space was eerily silent as the combined fleet of humanity and the Galactic Coalition waited. The stars seemed to hold their breath, their light dimmed by the looming threat on the horizon. On the bridge of the Elysium, Captain Elias Grant stood with his crew, his eyes fixed on the holographic display. The swarm was close, so close that their ships could now be seen as faint red dots against the blackness of space. "All systems ready, Captain," Dr. Lyra reported, her voice calm but firm. "Shields at maximum. Weapons armed." Grant nodded, his expression grim. "Hold position. Wait for my signal." Across the fleet, the tension was palpable. Admiral Krell stood on the bridge of his flagship, his scaled hands gripping the railing as he watched the swarm approach. The Coalition's ships were in formation, their weapons trained on the enemy, but Krell couldn't shake the feeling of unease that gnawed at him. "Admiral," Lieutenant Vora said, breaking the silence. "The swarm is entering firing range." Krell's jaw tightened. "Hold steady. We need to draw them in." The swarm's fleet was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Their ships were jagged and organic, their surfaces pulsating with a sickly red glow. They moved as one, a relentless wave of destruction that seemed to consume the very fabric of space. As the swarm drew closer, Grant's voice crackled over the comms. "All ships, prepare to engage. On my mark." The fleet braced itself, the tension reaching a breaking point. Then, as the swarm crossed into the designated kill zone, Grant gave the order. "Fire." The void erupted in a blaze of light as the combined fleet unleashed its weapons. Energy beams, plasma cannons, and missiles streaked through the darkness, slamming into the swarm's ships with devastating force. Explosions lit up the battlefield, their shockwaves rippling through space. For a moment, it seemed as though the swarm had been halted. But then, the unthinkable happened. The swarm's ships began to regenerate. "Captain!" Dr. Lyra shouted, her voice filled with alarm. "Their ships are repairing themselves." Grant's eyes widened as he watched the holographic display. The swarm's ships, damaged just moments ago, were now whole again, their jagged hulls pulsating with renewed energy. "They're adapting," Grant muttered. "Just like we feared." On the Coalition flagship, Krell watched in horror as the swarm's fleet continued to advance. "Admiral, what are your orders?" Vora asked, her voice trembling. Krell's mind raced. The swarm was unlike any enemy they had ever faced. Their ability to regenerate made them nearly unstoppable. But there had to be a way. "Focus fire on their lead ships," Krell ordered. We need to break their formation. The Coalition's ships adjusted their aim, concentrating their firepower on the swarm's largest vessels. Explosions lit up the void as the lead ships were torn apart, but the swarm's advance didn't slow. If anything, it seemed to grow more determined. On the Elysium, Grant watched the battle unfold with a growing sense of dread. The swarm was relentless, their ships closing in despite the fleet's best efforts. "Captain," Dr. Lyra said, her voice urgent. "We're detecting a massive energy surge from the swarm's fleet. It's unlike anything we've seen before." Grant's eyes narrowed. "What kind of energy?" Before Lyra could answer, the swarm's ships unleashed a devastating attack. A wave of red energy swept through the void, slamming into the fleet with unimaginable force. Shields buckled, and ships were torn apart as the energy wave consumed everything in its path. "Evasive maneuvers!" Grant shouted, but it was too late. The energy wave struck the Elysium, sending the massive ship reeling. Alarms blared as the crew struggled to maintain control. "Shields at 40%, one of the officers reported. "Hull integrity compromised." Grant gripped the railing, his mind racing. The swarm's power was beyond anything they had anticipated. If they didn't find a way to stop them soon, the entire fleet would be destroyed. "Admiral Krell," Grant said over the comms, his voice strained. "We need to fall back. We can't hold them here." Krell's response was immediate. "Agreed. All ships, retreat to the secondary defense line. We'll regroup and plan our next move." The fleet began to pull back, their ships battered but still intact. The swarm pursued, their relentless advance a grim reminder of the stakes. As the Elysium moved to join the retreat, Grant turned to Dr. Lyra. "We need to find a weakness," he said, his voice filled with determination. "There has to be a way to stop them." Lyra nodded, her expression grim. "We'll analyze the data. But we're running out of time." Grant's eyes hardened. "Then we'll make every second count." The retreat was chaotic. Ships scrambled to regroup at the secondary defense line, their hulls scarred and their crews shaken. The swarm's relentless advance had left the Alliance reeling, and the mood aboard the Elysium was grim. Captain Elias Grant stood in the ship's command center, his eyes fixed on the holographic display. The swarm's fleet was still advancing, their jagged ships glowing with an eerie red light. The Alliance had managed to slow them down, but it wasn't enough. "Captain," Dr. Lyra said, her voice breaking the silence. "We've analyzed the swarm's energy patterns. There's something unusual." Grant turned to her, his expression sharp. "What is it?" Lyra gestured to the display, where a series of complex waveforms flickered. "The swarm's energy is centralized. It's not coming from individual ships, it's being generated by a single source. If we can destroy that source, we might be able to disrupt their entire fleet." Grant's eyes narrowed. "Do we know where the source is?" Lyra hesitated. "We've pinpointed its location. But it's deep within their fleet. Getting to it won't be easy." Grant's mind raced. The swarm's fleet was massive, and their ships were heavily armed. Sending a strike team to destroy the energy source would be a suicide mission. But what choice did they have? "We need to act fast," Grant said finally. "If we don't stop them now, they'll overrun the entire sector." Lyra nodded, her expression grim. "I'll prepare the data. But Captain, this plan will require a sacrifice." Grant's jaw tightened. He knew what she meant. The mission would be dangerous, almost certainly fatal. But if it meant saving the galaxy, it was a risk they had to take. Admiral Krell's voice crackled over the comms. "Captain Grant, we've received your data. The plan is risky, but it's our best chance. My fleet will provide cover while you make your move." Grant nodded, even though Krell couldn't see him. "Understood." We'll need to move quickly. The Alliance's ships regrouped, their battered hulls gleaming in the starlight. The swarm's fleet was closing in, their red glow growing brighter with every passing moment. On the Elysium's bridge, Grant addressed his crew. "This is it," he said, his voice steady. "We've faced impossible odds before, and we've always found a way to survive. This time is no different. We're not just fighting for ourselves, we're fighting for the entire galaxy. And we will not fail." The crew nodded, their faces filled with determination. They knew the risks, but they also knew what was at stake. As the fleet moved into position, Grant turned to Dr. Lyra. "Are you sure about this?" he asked quietly. Lyra met his gaze, her eyes filled with resolve. "It's the only way. And if it means saving billions of lives, it's a sacrifice I'm willing to make." Grant nodded, his heart heavy. He knew what had to be done. The battle began with a deafening roar as the Alliance's ships opened fire. Energy beams and missiles streaked through the void, slamming into the swarm's fleet with devastating force. The swarm retaliated, their red energy waves tearing through the Alliance's defenses. Amid the chaos, the Elysium surged forward, its massive hull cutting through the swarm's ships like a blade. The crew worked tirelessly, their hands flying over the controls as they navigated the treacherous battlefield. "We're approaching the energy source," Lyra reported, her voice tense. "But the swarm's defenses are too strong. We'll never make it through." Grant's eyes narrowed. "Then we'll have to create a distraction." He turned to the comms officer. "Contact Admiral Krell. Tell him to focus all firepower on the swarm's lead ships. We need to draw their attention away from us." The officer nodded, relaying the message. Moments later, the Coalition's ships unleashed a barrage of fire, their weapons slamming into the swarm's lead vessels. The swarm's fleet shifted, their ships turning to face the new threat. "Now!" Grant shouted. "Full speed ahead." The Elysium surged forward, its engines roaring as it plunged into the heart of the swarm's fleet. The ship shuddered as it took hit after hit, its shields flickering under the relentless assault. "Shields at 20%, one of the officers reported. "Hull integrity failing." Grant gripped the railing, his knuckles white. "We're almost there. Hold steady." As the Elysium approached the energy source, the swarm's ships closed in, their red glow growing brighter. The ship's hull groaned under the strain, and alarms blared as critical systems began to fail. "Captain!" Lyra shouted. "We're in range." Grant's eyes hardened. "Do it." Lyra's hands flew over the controls, her movements precise and deliberate. The ship's core began to hum, its energy building to a crescendo. "Energy pulse ready," Lyra said, her voice trembling. "On your command." Grant took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. This was it. The moment of truth. Fire. The energy pulse erupted from the Elysium, a blinding wave of light that swept through the swarm's fleet. The swarm's ships shuddered as the pulse struck, their red glow flickering and fading. For a moment, the battlefield fell silent. Then, the swarm's ships began to collapse, their jagged hulls crumbling into dust. The energy source at the heart of their fleet was gone, and with it, their power. On the Elysium's bridge, the crew cheered, their voices filled with relief and triumph. But Grant's eyes were fixed on the display, his heart heavy. The ship's core was failing, its energy depleted. The Elysium had given everything to stop the swarm, and now it was paying the price. "Captain," Lyra said quietly. "We need to evacuate." Grant shook his head. "There's no time. The core is going critical." Lyra's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded. "Then we'll face it together." Grant turned to his crew, his voice steady. "It's been an honor serving with you. You've all made the ultimate sacrifice, and the galaxy will never forget it. The crew nodded, their faces filled with pride and sorrow. As the Elysium's core reached critical mass, the ship was consumed in a blinding explosion of light. The shockwave rippled through the void, a final testament to the crew's bravery and sacrifice. The void was silent once more, the echoes of the battle fading into the endless expanse of space. The swarm's fleet was gone, their jagged ships reduced to dust. The Alliance's ships, battered and scarred, drifted in the aftermath, their crews stunned by the sudden turn of events. On the bridge of the Coalition flagship, Admiral Krell stared at the holographic display, his scaled hands trembling. The swarm had been defeated, but the cost had been unimaginable. The Elysium was gone, its sacrifice a stark reminder of the price of victory. "Admiral," Lieutenant Vora said quietly, breaking the silence. "We've received reports from the fleet. Casualties are high, but we've won." Krell nodded slowly, his mind heavy with grief and relief. "And the Elysium?" Vora's voice was barely above a whisper. "There were no survivors." Krell closed his eyes, his heart aching. He had doubted the humans, questioned their motives, and yet they had given everything to save the galaxy. Their sacrifice would not be forgotten. Across the sector, the news of the swarm's defeat spread like wildfire. Planets that had been on the brink of destruction rejoiced, their people celebrating the Alliance's victory. But amidst the celebrations, there was also sorrow. On a small, remote colony, a group of humans gathered to honor the crew of the Elysium. They had been scattered and forgotten for centuries, but now they stood tall, their heads held high. "They gave everything," an elderly man said, his voice filled with pride. "Not just for us, but for the entire galaxy. They showed us what it means to be human." The crowd nodded, their eyes filled with tears. For the first time in centuries, humanity had a reason to hope. In the Coalition's High Council chamber, the mood was somber. The representatives sat in silence, their faces etched with grief and gratitude. Admiral Krell stood before them, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "The swarm has been defeated," he said. "But the cost was high. The crew of the Elysium gave their lives to save us all. They showed us that even in the darkest times, there is hope. And they reminded us that we are stronger together than we are apart." The room was silent as the representatives absorbed his words. Finally, the Zorath representative spoke. "We owe the humans a debt we can never repay. Their sacrifice has changed us all." The Aquarian representative nodded. "Perhaps it is time to rewrite our history. To honor the humans not as enemies, but as allies. As friends." One by one, the other representatives agreed. The alliance had been forged in fire, and it would endure. As the galaxy began to heal, a new era dawned. The Coalition and humanity worked together to rebuild what had been lost, their bond stronger than ever. Monuments were erected to honor the crew of the Elysium, their names etched in stone as a reminder of their bravery. On the edge of the Orion sector, where the final battle had taken place, a single star shone brighter than the rest. It was said to be the light of the Elysium, a beacon of hope for all who looked to the stars. And as the galaxy moved forward, the lessons of the past were not forgotten. The swarm had been a reminder of the dangers of division, but humanity's return had shown the power of unity. In the end, it was not technology or weapons that had saved the galaxy. It was courage, sacrifice, and the unbreakable spirit of those who refused to give up. And so, the story of the Elysium became a legend, a tale of hope and resilience that would be told for generations to come.